Hey guys, what's up? My name is Zach, and today we're doing a 2020 election prediction between Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump. So Elizabeth Warren announced her candidacy for the presidency of the United States a few days ago. I believe it was on New Year's Eve, making her the first official Democrat to announce her candidacy against Donald Trump. Overall, I do not believe that Elizabeth Warren is a wise choice for Democrats to make as a presidential nominee. This really comes down to her nationwide low approval, the Republicans' ruthless attacks against her throughout the course of the past few years, whether it's her alleging that she has Native American heritage, or just Trump's attacks on her for whatever she does in general. She is not a wise choice for the Democrats to make for a presidential nominee. Trump will have a field day with her, I believe, on a debate stage, as he has done on Twitter pretty much his entire time in office, just going after her, like I said, for pretty much whatever she does. And if she was nominated, I believe it would be somewhat of a Hillary Clinton part 2. I don't believe she would do as bad as Hillary Clinton, especially running against Donald Trump in his second term, or in his first term, rather. But I do believe that Donald Trump will go after her the same way that he went after Hillary Clinton, just for her being too liberal, too adhering to the Democratic Party. Although she does separate from Hillary Clinton a number of policies, especially when it comes to separating from the Democratic Party, many people still see her as a big-faced Democratic Party despite that. Even though she considers herself a progressive, she is still considered to be a moderate to liberal member of the Democratic Party, and this will have a very dire effect, I think, throughout the United States if she is nominated. So, looking at the safe states, I do believe that Elizabeth Warren will keep the typically safe Democratic states. However, I do believe there's a number of states that will move out of likely into solid for the Republicans, which I'll get to once I'm done filling in these states. But overall, I think you'll see, once I'm done with the electoral map, and once I provide my reasoning, that she is not, by any means, by any stretch of the imagination, at least at this point, a decent candidate for the Democrats to nominate. So, two states that I typically list as not solid for either party, I'm going to list as solid for the Republicans, and those two states are going to be Texas and Georgia. And this really comes down to what I was saying before. Elizabeth Warren is a New England Democrat, and already that should raise a lot of warning signs for when you're trying to run in Texas and in Georgia, two states that are still have a very solid Republican identity, and two states that you will need someone who does not adhere to the Democratic Party to win in as a Democrat. And Elizabeth Warren, I don't think will do any better than Hillary Clinton did in these two states, and I think there's a decent chance that she'd do worse. Just given her track record, just given her approval amongst independents, and amongst Democrats as well. There are a significant number of Democrats who don't approve of Elizabeth Warren terribly. And I think that although it may seem like a small factor, I think that many people see her as whiny. I think that many people see her as just not likable in general, just because she's very shrill, and I know that many of these factors seem very small and very minute. But when you're running on a presidential stage, small things like that can play a huge role, as they did with Hillary Clinton, in my opinion at least. So moving on, Maine's two electoral votes, I would consider. Let me just switch the color palette. I would consider those two electoral votes to be likely in Elizabeth Warren's column. I don't think that there's a good chance that these two electoral votes will go out of any Democrats' column. I think that even if the Democrats nominate someone who is just terrible, even worse than Elizabeth Warren, and I don't consider Elizabeth Warren to be a completely terrible candidate. I just think that compared to candidates like Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Beto O'Rourke, she just doesn't really compare that much. That's just my opinion. But I think that even if she or any other just not terribly good Democrat is nominated, they will still hold on to those two electoral votes. Same with New Mexico and Virginia. I think that those are two states that are very hard to shake out of the Democrats' hold at this point. Just looking at the midterms and just looking at their current political makeup, I would list those two states as likely in Elizabeth Warren's column. Colorado will come back to. North Carolina, I would list likely in Trump's column. This is a state that does have a very pretty solid Republican identity, as we saw in the midterms as well. It still does tilt towards Trump and the Republican Party as a whole. Its approval has been a bit rocky for Trump, and I think that's something he's going to have to look out for. But on a presidential stage, I do think that Republican turnout would be higher than it was during the midterms. And I think that when you're nominating someone like Elizabeth Warren, again, a New England Democrat running in the South, is never a good thing for the Democratic Party. As we saw with Hillary Clinton not that she's a New England Democrat, but someone who comes from the more like solid Democratic areas, like New England. Elizabeth Warren, I don't think would do very well in North Carolina. I do think she has a shot at appealing to that more typically Democratic base, at turning that out and appealing to the anti-Trump movement as a whole. And I think that is her best chance at winning in general, is just really igniting the anti-Trump movement. But that's not a whole lot to win on, just being completely anti-Trump. And for those reasons, I would list North Carolina likely in Trump's column. Same goes with Arizona. This state really overall is a moderate Republican state and is moving more and more farther from the right, as we've seen in the midterms as well. And I do think that Elizabeth Warren will not be able to appeal to those moderate Republicans at all. I think that they will be pushed into Trump's column. And for most of the Democrats, I'd list it as leaning, because I do think that most of the Democrats will appeal to those moderate Republicans who don't have a very favorable view of Trump to some degree. But Elizabeth Warren, I don't see doing that. I don't see her appealing to those moderate Republicans. I don't see her appealing to those independents either, pushing the state into likely for Trump. Colorado, although I didn't list it as likely with New Mexico and Virginia, as I usually do when listing those three states together, I will list it likely for Elizabeth Warren. The reason why I'm listing it separately is because I don't think that Elizabeth Warren will land that state as solidly as she would with New Mexico and Virginia. And that's because I think that the state has a slightly more Republican tendency and a slightly more moderate tendency than those two states. And I think that that will be an obstacle for her to overcome in Colorado. However, Elizabeth Warren does list herself as a progressive, although most progressives don't see her as one. I'm a progressive, and I don't consider Elizabeth Warren to be a progressive. I consider it just to be more of a slightly left-leaning Democrat. But I think that just listing herself as a progressive will do her some good overall in Colorado, which is a pretty progressive, or a progressive-tending state. At least it does have a significant number of progressives, which would turn out for a progressive candidate in general. New Hampshire, I think, would be closer for Elizabeth Warren than other candidates, but I'd still list it likely in our column. We're seeing this state, New Hampshire a few years ago, or a few election cycles ago, was a complete toss-up. Many people listed it as a kind of a toss-up in 2016, even though it was much more closer than expected. But we're seeing the state have a much more stronger Democratic identity, and I think that it's very unlikely to swing back into the toss-up column. And for that reason, I would list it likely in Elizabeth Warren's column. I think that New England appeal will also have some degree of a factor in New Hampshire. Moving over to leaning states, I would list. Did I miss Nebraska's second? I did. I did miss Nebraska's second. I would list that as likely in not Elizabeth Warren's column, in Trump's column. And this really comes down to the fact that although it does contain Omaha, which is a pretty urban area, as we saw in 2016, Democrats don't have a very strong appeal to this area in general, unless you're coming from outside the Democratic Party or outside of what many would be considered to be a typical Democrat. You don't really have much of a very good chance in this area, and I think that Elizabeth Warren is absolutely in that category as being a pretty typical Democrat and as being a big face for the Democratic Party. And for that reason, I think that she would lose that district. Moving on to leans now. I would list Iowa leaning in Trump's column. The reason why it's not likely, which I would list it likely, is because I think that Elizabeth Warren will capitalize to some degree on the resentment that many of the farmers in this area have against Trump. And we saw in the midterms that this state is moving more towards Democrats in general, especially considering Trump's pretty large victory margin in the state in 2016. However, I don't believe that Elizabeth Warren will be able to win the state. The only reason why I'm not going to call it as likely for Trump is because there is a certain unpredictability for the state, and I think that Elizabeth Warren, if she chooses to go a certain route, could appeal to those moderates and to those progressives as well. But that's a very specific route for her to go that I don't think will happen. So for that reason, I would list it leaning for Trump. Moving over to Nevada, I'm going to list this state leaning in Elizabeth Warren's column. I'm going to start calling it more likely for Democrats in general, but not for Elizabeth Warren. And this is really because, although Nevada many people see as a solid to pretty likely state for the Democrats, if you're going to nominate a typical run-of-the-mill Democrat like Elizabeth Warren, which I think that Trump, if he were to paint her as a run-of-the-mill Democrat and is just a a shill for the Democrats overall. That would be very beneficial for him, especially in states like Nevada, because Nevada does not, at least as a state and as a political ideology, does not like those typically run-of-the-mill Democrats, those Nancy Pelosi Democrats, Elizabeth Warren Democrats, which I usually say as an analogy when with other candidates, but now it's actually the case. It's Elizabeth Warren running, and I don't think that she would do very well in Nevada. But still, Nevada has been developing a much stronger Democratic identity, as we saw at the midterms, electing a Democratic senator and a Democratic governor, making the state's at large the state's statewide political identity completely blue. And I think that she would struggle in Nevada, but I do think that she'd still land in her column. Moving on, go over to Minnesota. Again, I think that the state will be competitive and more competitive than other Democrats. I think that Elizabeth Warren will struggle throughout the Rust Belt in general, especially with Trump going after her for being a Hillary Clinton-esque kind of Democrat. But I still think she would land Minnesota in her column. I think it's very hard for Minnesota to not go in the Democrats' column, considering that Hillary Clinton won it in 2016, and the only way for a Democrat to not win it in 2020 would be for it to go even lower than it for Hillary Clinton, which is very unlikely in of itself. But I think that Warren would come close, to say the least. Ohio, I would list as leaning for Trump. I think that Elizabeth Warren would not do well in a state like Ohio at all. I think that Trump's attacks on her for claiming to be Native American, for, like I said, being a run-of-the-mill Democrat, will cost her dearly throughout the Rust Belt, and I think that'll show up pretty well in Ohio. I think that Trump will be able to win this state by a pretty solid margin. Not as solid as he did in 2016, obviously, but I think he will be able to hold on to it with a relatively good margin. Maine second, I would call leaning for Trump. I think that Elizabeth Warren's New England identity will play a factor in this district, but I think it will go very narrowly to Trump. Michigan, again, throughout the Rust Belt, I think that Elizabeth Warren will have a very, very hard time winning, or a very hard time holding on to. But Michigan, I would call leaning in her column. Trump's approval here is dismally low, and I think that, honestly, if you're going to nominate a candidate with a very strong anti-Trump kind of campaign going on, which I think almost any other Democrat, which I think most Democrats are going to do, and I think Elizabeth Warren would be very wise to do as well. I think that's almost enough to win in Michigan and in many parts of the Rust Belt narrowly. I don't think that's a good thing to do. I don't think that just running on an anti-Trump campaign and just being anti-Trump is a great way to run. But if Elizabeth Warren is going to do that, and I think that's honestly her best shot, considering that's what she's been doing pretty much throughout the past 2 years. And I think that's how she's going to run in 2020 as well. I think that's might be enough to win Michigan. But I think she's going to struggle while doing it. Florida, I'm going to call leaning in Trump's column. As we've seen in the midterms, the state still is slightly leaning in the Republicans' column. I think that Elizabeth Warren will not do a great job at appealing to the moderates and the independents in this area, and I think that Trump will be able to hold on to it. Pennsylvania, I think, will be very close. I think that Elizabeth Warren will be able to hold on to it, just given her, just given the fact that this state barely went to Trump in 2016. I know I keep citing 2016, but I'm not citing it as reasons. I'm just citing the margins, because Trump won in this state by a very, very slim margin, and the odds of him winning this state by that same margin or lower, because I don't think he's going to increase his margin, are very small in of itself. So Elizabeth Warren, I think, will be able to take the state by a small margin. I think that she'd do very bad in Pennsylvania and throughout the Rust Belt compared to other Democrats, but I think she will be able to hold on to it. So it really comes down to Wisconsin, in my opinion, between Warren and Trump. And I think that Elizabeth Warren will very slightly hold on to Wisconsin, making her the victor in this scenario. But overall, as you can see, Elizabeth Warren is by no means the best candidate for the Democrats to run. There are Democrats who, the Democratic Party should be doing much better on the electoral map in general. They should not be winning by this small of a margin in this hypothetical scenario. As you can see, there's a tremendous amount of ways for Trump to win here, not a tremendous amount of ways for Warren to increase this already very small lead. I think that there's a big possibility that Trump can win Wisconsin. There's a big possibility he can take Pennsylvania. Well, not a big possibility. There's a slight possibility. The only states I think that I can see Warren winning in that is already in Trump's column is maybe Florida, maybe Iowa, but that's kind of a stretch already. But overall, Elizabeth Warren, not the best candidate for Democrats to run. And I guess we'll see how that goes in the primary. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I know I've been posting a lot less frequently lately, and I know I've been saying I'm going to post more often, but honestly, I can't make that promise anymore. I've been very busy. I'm going to continue to be very busy. I'll just post whenever I can, and hopefully you guys enjoy when I do post. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, share, and subscribe. It helps small channels like mine to grow, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Bye.